Story number 1. Substation 9. I arrived at the decommissioned substation outside Havre at 0900 hours on the 16th of March to conduct the final asset inventory before the property transferred to private ownership. The facility had been offline for 11 months following the completion of the regional grid modernization project. My assignment was straightforward: verify all equipment status, document any remaining materials with salvage value, and certify the site as fully decommissioned. The access road was in poor condition, and I noted several sections where spring melt had washed out the gravel base. The perimeter fence showed signs of weathering but remained intact. I documented the exterior condition with photographs and proceeded to the main equipment yard. The day was overcast, temperature approximately 38 degrees, winds steady from the northwest. The main transformer was still warm to the touch. I placed my palm against the housing and felt distinct heat, not ambient warmth, but the kind of residual temperature that suggests recent operation. I checked my notes. The facility had been disconnected from the grid on April 22nd of the previous year. I walked the perimeter of the transformer and noted a faint 60 Hz hum, the characteristic sound of active electrical equipment under load. I visually confirmed that all breakers showed open position. The feed lines had been physically disconnected, with the severed cable ends clearly visible where they had been cut and capped. I documented this with photographs and measurements. There was no possible source of electrical current. I proceeded with the standard walkthrough, moving through the equipment yard and noting the condition of the circuit breakers, disconnect switches, and lightning arrestors. Everything appeared consistent with a facility that had been properly decommissioned. I entered the control room at approximately 0945 hours. The analog gauges were registering active load distribution. The control room had not been updated during the modernization project, and the original 1973 instrumentation remained in place. 7 large analog gauges dominated the main panel, each corresponding to a specific circuit branch. All 7 needles were positioned in the active range, showing loads between 40 and 70% of capacity. I tapped each gauge face. The needles held steady. I consulted the decommissioning checklist and confirmed that all circuits had been de-energized and tagged out according to protocol. I returned to the equipment yard and physically verified the open breakers and disconnected feeds a second time. I photographed each connection point. The evidence was clear. No electrical current could be flowing through this facility. When I returned to the control room, the needles had moved. Circuit 3 now showed 82% load. Circuit 5 had dropped to 31%. I attempted to contact my supervisor using the radio. The speaker produced only the same steady 60 Hz hum I had heard at the transformer. I tried my personal phone. The hum was present there as well, underlying any attempt to place a call. I could hear the ringtone, but beneath it and growing louder was that same electrical frequency. I have worked in power distribution for 16 years. I know the sound of live equipment. I know the feel of an energized system. This facility was active. The hum increased in volume over the next 20 minutes. It was no longer confined to the transformer or the control room. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, a deep resonance that I felt in my chest as much as heard. I moved through the facility documenting everything, taking photographs and measurements, following the procedures I had been trained to follow, even as those procedures became increasingly inadequate to the situation. At 1000 hours, I observed the needle on the master gauge climbing steadily. It moved from 64% to 71% over the course of 3 minutes. I watched it climb. There was no fluctuation, no variance, just smooth, steady increase. I returned to the equipment yard and confirmed for the 3rd time that no power source existed. The transformer connections were cold steel and empty air. The breakers were open. The system was dead. The master gauge read 88% when I returned to the control room. I am not trained for this situation. There is no protocol for equipment that operates without power for systems that function after they have been killed. I made the decision to attempt the emergency manual shut-off sequence, though I understood the absurdity of trying to deactivate equipment that was already deactivated. The manual shut-off is a mechanical system, a series of physical disconnects that can be triggered by a lever mechanism in the control room. It exists for situations where electronic controls have failed. I had never used it outside of training scenarios. I pulled the lever at 10-12 hours. Nothing changed. The needles continued their positions. The hum continued. The master gauge reached 93%. I documented everything. I took photographs of the gauges, the disconnected feeds, the open breakers. I recorded the temperature of the transformer housing, which had increased to 106 degrees Fahrenheit. I noted the time and conditions. I filled out the sections of the report that had spaces for observations. There was no space for what I was observing. At 10:15 hours, the hum ceased. The silence was immediate and total. All 7 gauge needles dropped to 0 in the same instant. The master gauge fell from 96% to nothing. I felt the absence of the hum as a physical change, a pressure that had been present and was now gone. My radio produced static when I keyed it. My phone showed normal signal strength. I contacted my supervisor and reported that I had completed the preliminary walkthrough and was proceeding with the detailed inventory. I spent the next 4 hours documenting every piece of equipment on the property. I measured, photographed, and catalogued. I verified serial numbers and checked maintenance records. I found nothing unusual. The transformer was cool to the touch. The gauges in the control room all read 0. The facility was exactly what it should be, a decommissioned electrical substation containing obsolete equipment with minimal salvage value. I completed the inventory and filed the standard report. I listed all equipment as decommissioned and inert. I noted minor weather damage to the access road and recommended grading before the property sale. I certified the site as clear for transfer to private ownership. I did not mention the warm transformer or the active gauges or the hum that had no source. There were no fields in the report form for that information. The site was sold to a data storage company 6 weeks later. I was reassigned to substations in the Eastern District on May 2nd. No explanation was provided for the reassignment, and I did not request one. My supervisor mentioned during my final briefing in Havre that the new owners had demolished the control room building during their first week of construction. The transformer was sold for scrap. The file was marked complete and archived. I have not been asked about the site since. Story number 2, Intake 23. I arrived at the former Riverside Behavioral Health Intake Center on the afternoon of October 15th to complete the final compliance walkthrough. The facility had lost its operating license in June following a state review that documented multiple patient care violations. My assignment was to verify that all client records had been transferred to the state archive and that the premises were ready for property disposition. Standard closure procedure. The building had been empty for 4 months. I parked in the staff lot and used the master key provided by the county facilities office. The front entrance opened without resistance. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. Afternoon light came through the unwashed windows at angles that made the lobby feel smaller than it was. I began in the administrative wing. The intake coordinator's office was on the 2nd floor, and when I opened the door, I found the patient files still there. Rows of manila folders arranged on metal shelving, organized by month and year. They should have been collected in July. I made a note and began photographing each shelf for the transfer documentation. It was while I was standing at the 3rd shelf that I heard the phone ringing. The sound came from deeper in the building, from what I recognized as the assessment wing. I stopped and listened. The ringing continued at regular intervals, 8 seconds of tone, 4 seconds of silence. I checked my notes. Utilities had been disconnected on June 23rd. I walked into the hallway and the ringing grew louder. I followed procedure and called dispatch to request that building security meet me before I proceeded further into the structure. The dispatcher put me on hold, then came back and told me there was no security contract on file for that address. No one else had been issued keys. I was the only person with authorized access. I continued toward the assessment wing. The ringing was coming from the north corridor. As I approached, I could identify it as Intake Room 4. The door was propped open with a rubber wedge. Inside, the wall-mounted phone was off the hook. The receiver hung by its cord, stretched toward the observation window as if someone had been holding it and then let it drop. The base unit was ringing. Not the receiver tone you hear when a line is open, but the incoming call sound. I stepped into the room and lifted the receiver. I placed it back on the base. The ringing stopped. Then every phone in the corridor began to ring. I counted 6 rooms, 6 phones, all ringing in unison. The sound was identical in pitch and rhythm. It matched the pattern I remembered from the patient call system, the one used to alert staff when someone in assessment needed assistance. I had reviewed the facility operations manual as part of the license investigation. The system had been described in the training appendix. I walked to the next room and opened the door. The phone inside was ringing, receiver on the base, cord coiled. I lifted the receiver and heard nothing, no dial tone, no static. I replaced it and the ringing continued. I repeated this in the 3rd room with the same result. I returned to the main corridor and the ringing stopped. All 6 rooms went silent at once. I stood there for several seconds, listening. The building was quiet. I could hear my own breathing and the faint sound of wind against the exterior walls. I decided to exit and request a facilities supervisor before continuing the inspection. I walked back through the administrative wing to the main entrance. I inserted my key into the lock and turned it. The key would not rotate. I applied more pressure and felt the mechanism resist. I removed the key and examined it. It was the same key I had used 90 minutes earlier. I tried again. The lock would not turn from the inside. I checked the secondary exit on the east side of the building. The door was marked as emergency access only. I pushed the bar and it opened. No alarm sounded. I stepped outside and let the door close behind me. I walked around the perimeter to the main entrance and tested my key from the outside. It turned without issue. I returned to my vehicle and completed an initial incident report on my laptop. I documented the patient files that had not been transferred, the phone activity, and the lock malfunction. I recommended that the building be sealed and that a structural and electrical assessment be conducted before any further access was authorized. I submitted the report to my supervisor by secure upload at 4:37 that afternoon. The following morning, I received a call instructing me to forward all documentation related to the Riverside facility to the Office of Facility Oversight. My supervisor told me the property transfer had been reassigned to another division. I was not to return to the site. I was not to discuss the walkthrough with other staff. The case file was being moved to a restricted access category. I complied with the instruction. I uploaded my photographs, my written notes, and the incident report to the designated server. I received a confirmation receipt. 3 days later, I checked the internal database and found that the Riverside file had been archived under administrative closure. No further action required. Story number 3. Depot access. I arrived at the depot on the morning of the 14th of June 2023 with sampling equipment and a clipboard listing 17 inspection points. The assignment was routine environmental compliance work ahead of the scheduled demolition in September. The site had been inactive since 2011 and my supervisor said the paperwork was a formality required by the county before they could proceed with the teardown. The site manager met me at the gate. He was a contractor named Hollis, maybe 60 years old, who'd been watching the property since the decommission. He mentioned that 2 security guards had quit the previous week without giving notice. He said it was the heat and the isolation. The depot sat on 43 acres of scrubland, and the nearest town was 18 miles north on a farm road that didn't see much traffic. I started with the motor pool area, taking soil samples near the old fuel islands. The concrete was cracked and bleached by the sun, and the pumps had been removed years earlier, leaving only the mounting bolts. I logged the samples and moved on to the underground storage system. There were 6 tanks, each with a capacity of 10,000 gallons, connected to a monitoring station in a cinderblock shed near the fence line. When I opened the shed, I noticed all 6 pressure gauges showed identical readings, 2.3 psi on every dial. I checked my notes. According to the decommission records, 3 of the tanks had been emptied and sealed. 2 were at partial capacity, and 1 had been flagged for remediation due to a slow leak. The gauges should have shown different pressures or no pressure at all for the empty ones. I radioed Hollis and asked if anyone had serviced the monitoring equipment recently. He said no one had been in that shed for at least 2 years. I made a note to check the gauge calibration and continued the inspection. The maintenance tunnel entrance was behind the main vehicle bay, a steel hatch set into the concrete with a rusted ladder leading down. I'd reviewed the site plans the night before, and the tunnel ran beneath the depot, connecting the fuel system to the old generator room. I needed to verify the condition of the underground pipes before I could sign off on the environmental assessment. I descended the ladder with a flashlight and a handheld gas detector. The tunnel was narrow, maybe 5 feet high, with exposed conduit running along the ceiling. The air was cool and smelled like damp concrete. I followed the main line toward the fuel tanks, checking for leaks or corrosion. About 30 feet in, I noticed boot prints in the dust on the floor. They were distinct, recent, with a tread pattern that suggested work boots. I followed them with my flashlight. The prints formed a continuous loop, a circle maybe 10 feet in diameter, but there was no trail leading to or from the loop, just the circle, perfectly closed, as if someone had walked in place until the pattern was complete. I stood there for a moment, trying to work out an explanation. I thought maybe the prints had been there longer than they appeared, or that I'd missed a connecting trail in the dim light. I retraced my steps and checked again. There was no entry point, no exit, just the loop. I continued to the gauge junction and found the mechanical linkages corroded but intact. There was no reason for the gauges to show identical readings. I took photographs and marked the location on my site map, then returned to the surface. When I climbed out of the tunnel, my radio started transmitting. I hadn't keyed the mic, but a voice was coming through the speaker. It was reading coordinates. Not the standard military grid reference system we used, but an older format I recognized from training exercises that referenced Cold War-era maps. The voice was calm, methodical, repeating the same string of numbers every 15 seconds. I turned off the radio. The voice continued. I removed the battery. The transmission didn't stop. I set the radio on the ground and walked back to my truck, where I had a second unit. I tried to raise Hollis on the backup radio, but got no response. I tried my supervisor's office. No answer. I decided to call for a site evacuation. It was the correct protocol when equipment malfunctions in a potentially hazardous environment. I used my cell phone to dial my supervisor's direct line. The call went through, but instead of his voice, I heard ringing on the other end that sounded wrong, hollow. After 6 rings, he picked up. I explained the situation and said I was recommending we halt the inspection until we could get a technician out to check the monitoring equipment and the radio interference. He said he'd received my message and that I should proceed as planned. I told him I hadn't left a message. He said he was looking at the log right now and that I'd called his landline 20 minutes earlier to report equipment issues. I told him I hadn't called a landline. I didn't know he had one. He paused, then asked me to hold. When he came back, he said the landline had been disconnected in 2015 and that there was no record of any recent calls to that number. I walked back to the vehicle bay to find Hollis. The bay doors were opening and closing in sequence, one after another, each door rising fully before the next one began. There were 12 doors total, and they cycled through the pattern every 11 minutes. I checked the breaker panel inside the bay office. The main power had been shut off for over a decade. The motors shouldn't have been functional. I stood in the office and watched the doors complete 3 full cycles. Hollis was nowhere on site. His truck was gone. I tried his cell phone and got a message saying the number was no longer in service. I made the decision to classify the site as structurally compromised and left the depot at 4:37 in the afternoon. I drove directly to the county office and filed a recommendation for immediate demolition without completing the environmental survey. I cited equipment malfunction, possible electrical hazards, and unauthorized access to secure areas. My supervisor called me that evening and said the demolition had been moved up to early July. He said it will be conducted during a scheduled communications blackout for military exercises at a nearby base, and that I should consider the matter closed. I asked about the environmental assessment. He said it had been waived under emergency provisions. The demolition took place on the 9th of July. I was not present. My report was filed under infrastructure failure. Hollis transferred to a desk position in San Antonio, and I was reassigned to municipal water projects for the remainder of the fiscal year. The depot site was cleared and graded, and the land was returned to the county for agricultural use. No further action was required.